You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Matthew 5:27 through 30, written down so long ago, taps into so many of my major fears growing up and my current fears as a starting writer. Namely, what if some simple things I say, out of any of the millions of things I could say, affect someone as much as this quote affected me? To get to the bottom of that, we're going to have to dig through my puberty. At age 9, I met a girl. She used to call me the ugly spaceman, and somehow that pickup line worked. We talked to each other all the time. We wrote notes to each other. We were inseparable. We got in trouble for being so engaged in talking to each other that we just forget recess ended and we'd run into class late. I think at that age we mostly just argued about Pokemon. I don't remember what my favorite was, but I know for a fact that her favorite was Squirtle and she was fucking wrong. At age 10, we officially liked each other, and she wouldn't admit it, but she liked me a whole year before I liked her. Anyway, at the end of 5th grade, we had a field trip to a health center, and our entire grade sat down to listen to a woman explain about how our bodies were beginning to change. I think it was about the time she started talking about uteruses that I raised my hand. She called on me, and I stood up and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm mature enough for this." And I walked out of the room. Yeah, 10-year-old me just up and walked out of the room. So my teacher comes out and she has a conversation with me about it. She told me that I was very brave and that it was okay that I didn't want to understand right now, but that I was going to have to learn this eventually. Little did I know, I had pretty much just committed social suicide for a couple of years. Suddenly, the other school kids thought I was too mature to play kickball and wouldn't let me sit with them at the lunch table. But every so often, a kid would come up to me and thank me for what I did and say they would wish they were as brave as me. And honestly, that was enough. No, who the fuck am I kidding? Where were you at the kickball field? You just gonna leave me on the sidelines? Why didn't you have my back? Come on. At age 11, I broke up with my girlfriend. I was a child of divorced parents who passed me between the two of them every week. And I craved someone I could get consistent, loving attention from, so I was super clingy. And she was super annoyed, and I was super annoyed that she was super annoyed. If she liked me the way I liked her, then clearly she should be as clingy as I was. So we started to fight about it, and eventually I just decided this wasn't going to work out. Of course, at age 12, we got back together. I was still clingy, but I agreed to do better and to give her more space when she asked for it, and I was terrible at it, but I was trying. But around this time, I overheard a rumor about a 12-year-old boy titty-fucking a 12-year-old girl, which horrified me, but I had started to hear rumors like this more and more often. I also sort of learned what sex was on accident, that, daddy pees inside mommy's privates, which, At age 13, I discovered masturbation, and my hand was pretty busy just about every day since then. And soon after, I happened to search my girlfriend's name on the internet, which you can see where that's going. The blend of curiosity and shame, fear and excitement was all pretty instantaneous. I wanted to know what the other half's bodies looked like. I wanted to figure out this strange new sensation going on down there. But I also felt ashamed and confused. I knew changes were happening, that puberty was going on, that I'd start to want to have sex, but I didn't feel like there was anyone I could talk to about these emotions without taking on an intense sense of shame. Eventually, my mom installed porn blockers. My mom and stepdad were very disturbed and worried about the fact that I started looking at porn, but they didn't know how often I was doing it, but it was pretty often. But I figured out how to get around the porn blockers by searching obscure Japanese sites with even weirder stuff. At age 14, my youth group focused heavily on sexual purity, on making sure kids were abstinent. We learned that our bodies were pure and sacred and that we lose that if we had sex. We learned that our future spouses deserved that puberty and that denying our spouses our virginity on our wedding night would be an affront before God and mean that our marriage was doomed by our irresponsibility. After all, if we couldn't commit to being pure before our wedding night, how could we commit to a whole marriage? So when I found out that these two kids in my biology class were practicing a little of their own biology at home, I wrote them a one-page letter. I told them I was worried about their souls and their purity. But most importantly, they needed to repent, since sex was sacred, a thing between a husband and wife before God. There were going to be consequences for their having premarital sex now. Their souls had intertwined. And when they broke up, which they inevitably would because they're teenagers, their souls would irreparably rip apart. But they needed to stop now before things got even worse. They laughed at me for good reason. But I felt snubbed, like, and a bit like they should rot in hell. But mostly I was very worried that they weren't listening. But that hypocrisy started to hit home. I was masturbating, I was looking at pornography, I was struggling not to. I kept looking at other girls, and so my girlfriend and I played a game. I tallied on my hands how often I checked out the other girls, while she tallied on her hands how often she checked out other boys. My hand had at least 12 tallies on it. Hers had 3. She blew up. She was like, I didn't even really check them out. I might have thought one other boy was cute and then added the other 2 because I thought I'd meet you halfway, but you look at over a dozen girls, a dozen? She didn't talk to me for a while after that. So on my own, I instituted this rule. Every time I checked a girl out, I would have to do 10 push-ups as soon as possible. And this meant that you could occasionally spot me punishing myself by dropping to the floor during class, in the hallway, or at lunch tables. Eventually, the boys near me caught on, although most of the girls didn't. All the boys thought it was hilarious. Some of the girls found it funny, some of them found it creepy. Like, knowing every time I checked a girl out was kind of creepy, but then some of them also thought it was sweet in its own weird way. For me, it was absolutely embarrassing, but I was always the kid who was like, screw dignity. Integrity is all that matters. If my girlfriend and my future wife deserved a man who didn't have wandering eyes, and I was going to grow into that man even if it killed me. And it mostly worked. I mean, I got that number down to maybe 50 push-ups a week, and eventually got on par with her, and we decided that I didn't need to do this anymore. At age 15, I started realizing even more things. If our bodies were pure and I had a sexuality, then my sexuality was inherently damaging. My penis was inherently a vehicle for defilement, and I hated it. I hated having it. I hated that there was a part of me that sought to destroy the purity of girls, destroy my own purity, destroy the purity reserved for my future wife. I started feeling like a virus, a corrupter, or a vile, terrible thing. And my girlfriend would ask from time to time if I was still looking at porn, and I wouldn't lie to her. She would feel incredible jealousy and react so angrily to the fact that I was still looking at it, and that I was promising to stop, and that I was trying, and it was just so very hard, and it was impossible to explain why I couldn't stop. It was just not feasible. And she didn't know what to do about how I was growing more and more depressed over the fact that I couldn't stop cheating in this way. Like, clearly the solution is to just stop cheating. But as she started maturing herself, and as we started making out more, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was ruining her, that I was bringing my sin upon her, that I failed to quarantine myself and contain my unholy desires. She told me over and over again that it wasn't my fault, that it was her own choice, and that our purity was something we were both doing our best to be responsible for. But it wasn't convincing. I knew I was passing it on. I knew I was craving to pass it on, and I hated myself for it. This sort of shame surrounded me. My friends were all big into anime and harem manga like Love Hina. They thought it was hilarious to constantly call me a pervert like the girls did to the boys in those stories. I kept playing along, but I felt like they somehow knew what was going on, that they all somehow knew I was sick and diseased. And then, when I realized I didn't have much of a sense of smell, I started to panic, because I had no way of verifying if I still smelled like I had masturbated. Like, did masturbation even have a scent? When did the scent wear off? Would other people be able to smell the fact that I was sinning? Did everyone at my youth group know? And so I opened up to a youth group leader about my struggle. This particular leader was always ecstatic to see me. She thought I was the best kid, and she would introduce me to new students by telling them how great I was. And she did this in part because she knew I was very shy, so she wanted me to make more friends, but she also genuinely seemed to like me. So I trusted her, and I confided in her that I was struggling with porn and had even started cutting over how I couldn't stop masturbating. She got very quiet. She didn't know what to say. She asked me to talk to one of the male youth group leaders about it instead, and then she just didn't talk to me anymore. And I obsessed over it. I thought maybe somehow I was a strange symbol for her in her life, that I was like some innocent kid and I had figured out how to ruin that significance by like revealing this side of me that she didn't know existed. And As a result, she didn't even introduce new kids to me. She didn't even look at me. And I didn't know how to talk to her about that or even bring it up. So by the time the male youth group leader took me bowling to talk about it, I didn't open up at all. I just laughed and said I was okay. And when I asked about her if I did something wrong, he said, "Sorry, bud, but that's the kind of thing you should only talk to guys about." Eventually, I got a recommendation to go to a conference for men's purity. At the conference, they continued hammering in the idea that men were committing adultery by looking at pornography, and they comforted the wives who expected better of their husbands. And they did so through sermons and these weird interpretive dance routines. The point is, there were hundreds of defeated, deflated, hopeless men in the auditorium, all eager for anything to help them. They gave us recommendations of prayers, suggested we get accountability partners, and asked us to hand our sins over to Jesus for him to handle, but none of that worked. At age 16, my mom couldn't take it anymore. She came downstairs crying, bawling her eyes out on the couch, explaining to me that Ted Bundy was a porn addict. She was terrified that I was going to grow up to be a serial killer or a rapist if I didn't learn how to control myself. And I mostly just sat there really confused. And when she asked, I just laughed and told her I was okay and she had nothing to worry about. And in that moment, I was okay. I thought it was weird and surreal and impossible, but when I was vulnerable, that's all I could remember. It meshed with that weird The Passion of the Christ movie, and I realized that all of my sins contributed to the need to flog, flail, and crucify this perfect human being, this perfect God. That not only was I hurting my girlfriend, my youth group, my family, myself, my future wife, but also this perfect, beautiful gift of a human that God gave us. So I came to associate my orgasms with the image of Christ bleeding on the cross, his blood oozing down his skull. And that's when I started feeling like I actually was a rapist. Not in the traditional sense, but in the very slow sense of slowly enticing my girlfriend towards sex in my weaker moments when I wasn't strong enough or didn't have the willpower. That the only difference was how patient I was. I didn't think of myself as a boy learning about his sexuality at his own pace, this very natural process of growing up. I thought I was specifically patiently working my way toward convincing my girlfriend that she wanted it so I could take her innocence. By age 17, this was my ritual. I would come home from school and be home alone for hours. I'd pray for the full armor of God. I'd command Satan to be gone and ask Jesus to enter my heart and my home. And at a certain point, I'd start shaking, literally trembling. And the trembling might continue for 5 minutes or for 2 whole hours, however long it took to give in. Most nights I just gave in at the 5-minute mark because it just wasn't worth sitting there shaking and praying for hours just to end up sinning anyway. So I'd slink down into the basement, and waiting for me at the computer screen was a picture of Jesus taped to the upper right corner. I'd sigh and feel the weight of my sin as I searched sites that avoided the porn blockers. I'd pull down my pants, and when I was turned on, well, I had this chain necklace that my girlfriend gave me. It was the Xanarkin symbol from Final Fantasy X because I was the Tidus to her, you know. And it would be wrapped around my hand, and every time I'd have to physically remove this chain that represented my oath to her. And because of how often I cut my palms, I could feel the ridges while I was, you know. And it didn't matter if it hurt or if I reopened a cut and it started bleeding a little. Nothing was going to stop me. So then, when I'd finish, I'd barely feel anything. I mean, I barely felt any pleasure the whole time. And if I did feel any pleasure, it was definitely not stronger than all of the abusive self-talk. Like, you cheating piece of shit, what the fuck is wrong with you? And then, don't you fucking curse? That's a sin too, you fucking piece of shit. You're so fucking useless. Like, that was what was going on in my head the entire time. And when I'd finish, I'd feel like I might as well just peed. Like, that's the level of orgasm we're talking about. Like, the kind that feels like a mildly relieving piss. And then with all the hormones taken care of, there wasn't anything left other than shame and Jesus' face in the corner staring at me while I clear the browser history and go back to wrapping the chain around my hand so tight in penance that it left behind bumps. I'd slip into this calm, terrible rage, like the kind of rage that's almost tranquil. It's just sheer control. So I take the butcher knife from the kitchen and hide in the bathroom and start cutting my palms again. And as this kept happening, things just kept getting weirder and weirder. I'd literally play with my blood in the sink, like make doodles on the porcelain like it was some kind of canvas. I would draw roses, fractals, thorns, and then I'd flush it all down the faucet and start over. One time I dug with my fingernails near my bicep until I drew a bunch of blood, and it took a while for that to stop bleeding, and I still have that scar. And I used that blood to write on a piece of paper that is honestly probably still hidden away somewhere in my childhood bedroom. I have no idea what I wrote on it. I just remember putting a crucifix on it in my own blood, and it might have even said kill me or save me. Frick. No idea. And then when I tried to sleep, the images I had seen that evening all came back. And I had to imagine Cloud from Final Fantasy VII taking his big old buster sword and chopping through all the images of naked women that I had seen dancing around in my head. And I'd lie there, praying that I would either die or lose my penis somehow in such a way that it would magically just grow back for my wedding night. Like, that would be perfect. If I couldn't have that, could the devil just, like, take pity on me and steal my virginity so that I would no longer have to force myself through this hell on earth just to be worthy of a Madonna like my girlfriend? Like, couldn't a whore come and just grant me freedom? I think that's the core of a Madonna whore complex, really. And it wasn't always that bad, but it was really bad often enough. And I would have done anything for the cycle to end. Which brings us back to Matthew 5:30. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. And I sat there with that butcher knife, and I held it against my wrist. But I thought of my future wife, and how she might want me to have two hands. So I decided not to do that. And then I held it against my testicles for a really, really long time. But I thought about how I really, really wanted to have kids one day, and my wife probably wanted to too. I had to talk myself out of doing this more nights than I can remember. And I think the worst thing about it was the idea that I would inevitably ruin my girlfriend's purity. I'd beg God to take mine, but please keep hers intact. But there was no way of doing that without cheating on her. Actually cheating, not just looking at porn. So I kept breaking up with her, but we kept getting back together because I didn't really want to. I just wanted the cycle to end. So for 2 years, I was as close to suicidal as you can get without acting on it. I lost pretty much all attachment to the idea of living. I consider myself a death seeker, someone who wanted death to find me, but wasn't willing to take the plunge himself. And the only thing keeping me going was the idea that I would eventually write a novel or tell people about these experiences. That it'd be fine if I suffered as long as someone else knew what I had gone through and was able to work with that information to do better than I could. But I still felt like I couldn't take my girlfriend down with me, so I broke up with her for the final time. And I went back to her one day when she was crying, and I asked her to just listen. And I got down on one knee and held her hand and just gave some crazy impromptu speech about how I wasn't yet a man deserving of her, that I needed to go and become the man God needed me to be so I could be her ideal husband and we could have that ideal family together after I figured out what was going on with me. And I still remember her crying and agreeing with me, but being so torn between thinking I was perfect and hating my fucking guts for doing this to her. And myself, I cried the entire drive home. We were together for over 7 years when we broke up for the final time. Still had our virginities intact. Pretty soon after that, I realized the whole fucking thing was absolutely imaginary. God, the Bible as the Word of God, virginity as anything other than a social construct, the idea that I was cheating, the idea that I deserved to destroy myself. And I didn't just go atheist, I went full-on nihilist. Nothing mattered, everything was imaginary, nothing could be proven, even mathematics, which was my favorite final bastion of pure logic. But even that felt like a sham when I realized that axioms are ultimately just assumptions. I was so bitter because everything I had done to myself was under the premises that I was a terrible, awful human being for having a sex drive, and none of them were even true. I just happened to have a self-soothing response which involved masturbating, which is actually super common. It wasn't at all sinful or wrong or even unhealthy. But everyone who contributed to this environment of interpreting these healthy things in these unhealthy ways wasn't doing so maliciously. They were doing it because they thought it was right, that it was what God wanted. So I couldn't even figure out how to blame them. Like, how could I be mad at them when I believed the same thing just last year, you know? When I finally did have sex, it didn't feel like anything. It felt the same as when I was in that basement, like mildly relieving. And I thought about how horrifying that would have been to get all the way to my wedding night and feel nothing. But feeling nothing is what I want to talk about in another video. The long, arduous, fucked up journey of healing. That's why I want to talk about 2016. Because by the middle of 2016, it was the closest I got to suicide since 2008. And by the end of 2016, I felt right and safe and healthy, and sex felt good and comfortable and nurturing rather than empty or dreadful. But before I go, I want to advocate for a few things, because I know that teenage me would not listen to adult me. That teenage me as a Christian would have just wrote off everything I said as me being an amoral atheist who gave up on God. Which isn't exactly true or what happened, but like, there's no real getting around the fact that I would be perceived that way. So we have to do something else. So people within Christianity have to reform Christianity and move away from this purity culture. Because I know a lot of people find it so unhealthy and almost think of it in terms of being survivors of purity culture. What I want is a culture that fosters teaching teenagers about healthy relationships, consent, and sex rather than leaving them to figure it out themselves. I knew kids in my high school that had unprotected anal sex in order to keep their virginities intact. That's the danger of inventing these weird ideas like purity, that crafty teenagers come up with really dumb ways to rationalize and circumnavigate rules when they're left in this abyss and they feel like the only people that can talk to about it are other teenagers. This heavy focus on purity is dangerous, and research shows that abstinence-only education has higher rates of teenage pregnancies and abortion compared to comprehensive sex ed. But that's not enough. We have to become the type of people who can speak openly and frankly and honestly about sex. Because it's not just enough to tell teenagers what the ideal thing to do is. We have to create an environment where teenagers opening up to adults about their struggles is met with open arms and love rather than shame. Teenage me might have figured out how to stop cutting sooner if I ever felt like it was safe for me to talk to an adult about just how much I was struggling. And it's the fact that teenagers don't feel safe talking to adults like this that just makes these problems grow from these tiny things into these ludicrous, humongous things. And I want a culture that teaches people that pornography and sex work is not inherently shameful and cares about these workers enough to protect them and make laws in their favor rather than laws that endanger them. And the way I look at porn now is not with a sense of dread and guilt, but a sense of appreciation. Like a beautiful person exposed their vulnerable bodies on camera and actually helped me have a decent orgasm. Like, that's actually pretty nice of them. And I even have a sense of appreciation for the people, mostly dudes, who make animated porn games. And yeah, one of them is one of my dude friends. And you know who you are. Thank you. It's a good game. But yeah, the fact that we don't talk about this stuff that allows what happened to me to keep happening to other kids, that allows these emotions to fester and rot at your insides. Like, I know that I'm an extreme example, but I also know that when I talk about this stuff, there are a lot of other men who have experienced this on some level, and I honestly think it's how guilty we felt as teenagers that causes us to lash out and slut shame and stigmatize sex work. Anyway, I know that was a long video, and I know it got real fucked up, but thank you so much for listening. I love you guys. Be good, be well, and most of all, be good to you.